Archdiocese Today is made possible by Ratterman Family Funeral Homes.
As we look at the body, are we not a head, a heart, and a hands? And can the head say, but I'm a head, and you're not a head, so you're less of the body? Or can the heart say, you know, I'm a heart, and you're the hands, and you're less of the body? Or are we all one body? And does the heart at times need to be questioned and challenged? Does the hands at times need to be questioned and challenged? That's part of what we call community. The body gathered, struggling with each other, figuring out how to work with each other, that when the head sends impulses to the hands, how does it use the heart to do that, and so on and so forth. So we know at some level that these things are important, and my invitation here is Paul calls us to that. You know, in this particular passage, and his understanding of church as a dynamic reality might have something for us even today in terms of our own separation, our own division, our own conflict that we find, even within the context of our own body right now. Did you have a comment?
So is there even, in your mind, a geometrical shape as you assign the others?
Well, I would use the body, of this particular group?
Me too. Started
It's a collage.
It's amorphic.
I don't know. I mean, just this section, I think these three would probably be different. This one I would see more in a sense of a hierarchical traditional sense than this one. This one, I don't know if I even see a connection of a circle, more in terms of maybe something like this. Again, these tend to be very, and I want to say this one too, to a certain extent, very personal, where this wasn't the reality here. That's the separation. These are dependent on my own ability. So a lot of time people in social justice get accused of being kind of lone rangers out there. Now, granted, they don't have a whole lot of support sometimes within communities, but it's a sense of, I'm going to do this. There's a sense of a personal drive at all of these. And here, there is a sense of a personal spirituality, but the religion aspect of it pulls us to a larger community. That's the part that they don't necessarily claim in the same way that I would. So, does that make sense? So I don't know if there's an actual image, but however you might depict this in a sense of a personal formation. Again, this is me. It didn't come out of the study, but as I look at it, I would say in my experiences, and the study did say, to a certain extent, gave examples that the personal aspects of one faith was more important personal choice here than this. There was just an assumption of what that choice should be. Yeah.
As someone in the X generation, like the very edge, that fits in that post-Vatican II, I see the first two, the traditionalizers and the centralists, as being a part of what we refer to as the JP2 generation. Because they are into social justice, or they are into the more traditional stuff because they grew up with John Paul more than anything else. And the other ones, the one on the bottom, the puralists, are really individuals who try to consider themselves to be culturally Catholic, but in reality they're secularists.
But know that but Jay, I'm going to push back a little bit, because the term secularist, the term relativist, the term of whatever is an assumption and a judgment based on a certain ecclesiology.
That's a question I'm making. Are these people we only see at Easter and Christmas?
Well, that's the judgment. That's the judgment. We only see them in Easter and Christmas. I'm just telling you, these people don't believe to be Catholic. According to the survey, think they have to do that. Each box defines this is what is truly Catholic. This is the challenge for us. And there's an expectation, when we think of church, we have a certain ecclesiology. Here's the point I'm trying to make. We have a certain ecclesiology as church. And I think to our detriment when we become either or, and not both end, for me, this is what's truly Catholic. This is it because it's dynamic. And we tend to think of things in absolute in boxes. And the reality is, it's the tension, if you will, the energy, the dynamism, the dynamics that exist in the challenging and inviting of this reality that makes us Catholic. It's not this lens, this box. It's never been, because our traditions and our practices have always changed throughout history and will continue to do. This group is challenged many times because for them, the question is some of these expressions naming and articulating their experience of God, because they're saying their experience of God is found and nurtured in very different ways. You see? And so how much are we listening to the body and the needs of the body and supporting the body, at the same time challenging the body to say you're connected to the body, you're not on your own, but at the same time, what do you have to offer to the body? You know, and if we really want to look at this in terms of, I'll give you a very real example. I talked to a young person who works for Child Protective Services as a social worker, goes in and out of homes, was raised through Catholic schools, goes in and out of homes, fights in courts, drives around at night into homes and so on and so forth, dangerous areas, in dangerous situations with drugs, violence, alcohol, so on and so forth. And this is her life. Okay? And the reason I was talking with her is because her sister, younger sister, asked her to be her confirmation sponsor. Now that would make sense to me. It made no sense to her. She said, I appreciate that, but you know what? I'm not really what you need as a sponsor. A sponsor should be able to do all these other things. That's religious. I'm not really religious. Okay? And so I was talking to this person, and they were telling me this story, and I said, really? I said, so, the question for me, I didn't say this to the person, they're in their 20s, but I was thinking, how have I helped them to define what it means to be religious, what it means to be Catholic? Is it just these things? Is it not what she's doing? And let me say this. If she's not coming to church and she cannot find a context for her lived faith, because the thing I said to her was, you went through Catholic schools. You've been a person raised in the faith. Do you not think that there's a connection to what you do to that? And she thought a while and she said, well, yeah, but I'm not religious. I don't have a structure. I don't have a context I can put it in. And my question to us is, if she doesn't find herself here, shame on us, not shame on her. You with me? Shame on us. If our practices and our beliefs and our tradition isn't large enough to embody and give context and the story of her work, then shame on us. And if we're going to be so bold and brazen to seeing things one way, then the body is less because she's not part of it. Not she's less. We're less because she's not part of the body. And I think if we go back to Paul and we listen to this dynamic reality of the body is less without the hands. The body is less without the heart, and so on and so forth. And so the invitation here I want to make, before the break, I'll take some questions, but I do want to give you a little bit of break, is how are we, this is where we're going after the break, how do we define ourselves in this body? Maybe not by these categories, but by other understandings of church, models of church we're going to move into. But for right now, I want to say, so then, looking at these groups, and this is where the study ended up, it said, as Catholics then, within this division and within this separation, what do all groups hold? What is of value and importance to all groups, something that we can sustain through this reality? And I think this is pretty important, and some of this is not the survey, it's me, so just keep that in context. But tell me if you feel differently about this. Okay, this is my idea. Okay? First thing I want to say that's important, I think, throughout this is our sense of community. You know, and my best communities, whether they be an individual with me or a group of people with me, are those people that can both affirm and challenge. They're the people that are closest to me that I know love me. That's important. I know they love me and I know they care for me. And that's why I open this door. Does that make sense? I know they care about me, so I know there's a certain interest here. That they're seeing something that I myself can't see, and I've trusted them in some ways to invite me to that. Okay? Part of the challenge, I think, in today's church is we tend to go here, these are the rules, and when you show me you do that, then that's what it feels like to many of the young adults, you know? So 6 months of this, 3 months of that, this class, this study, whatever. For them, it feels like hoops. How are we affirming them? How are we affirming that young girl that what she's doing is the work of God in the world? And by the grace of God goes her. And thank God for her, because I myself in the body would find it difficult to do that in terms of that. Are we affirming their already lived reality and giving name to it in a sense? What is our starting point? So community is important. The other thing I want to talk about that I think is important, that I think we sometimes know, and that's our understanding of sacraments. You know, the thing about sacraments is they point to mystery, another great Catholic word. And I think mystery can get kind of a bad rap in terms of we think of mystery as because we don't know, we're somehow less. We're not smart enough. We're not good enough. We're not holy enough. You know, if we were only more, we would fully understand. That mystery doesn't point to us. Mystery points to what we're trying to understand. It talks about the fullness of what is, that we can never fully understand God. Okay, we talk about the church. In Vatican II, one of the key things that came out is the church as a mystery. We could never fully understand the church because it's dynamic, because it's unexplainable. No one word, whether it be daisy or rose, going back to what Jay was saying, suffices. It's somewhere in the in-between. It's somewhere in the tension and the energy of both, you know. And a sacrament and the mystery always points to something more. The rituals of our sacrament are rich. You know, the way we gather together and the way we celebrate and the way we sacrament our big S, but also our little s realities in terms of our everyday life and so on and so forth, to say that God is made real and present in our celebration is profound for folks. And although we talk about many Catholics that leave the church because of preaching, inspiration, good music, just as many come back because when they go often to those places that they find that, they don't find this. So it's telling me that in our culture and our society, we are, across the board, looking for something more than. Because life all around us shows us there is more than. Does that make sense? Now, there is more than. And what a wonderful way we gather and sacramentally say, there is more. And that more is inviting us to being part of that more. You know, which gives us our third thing, which we should capitalize on as people of faith, is our sense of hope. There's nobody across anywhere here that does not have a deep sense of hope. And what better hope can you be provided other than one of faith? You know, that sense of life after death. And not only our physical death, but that even in the darkest, gloomiest, worst part of our aspects of our life, which we all go through, God emerges, life emerges, resurrection. Not resuscitation of bringing back but what was, but something anew. You know, that constant challenge of being able to let go, accept, be open to God's grace to see what will emerge. It's at the essence of all of this. And when I'm here and I'm struggling with my kids and the high divorce rate and the different places, work and sports and schools and all the commitments in life are calling me to, I still am in need of both that sense of community, that sense of hope, and that sense of sacraments and rituals that I express. Now, I don't say that's a totally exhaustive list of what it is. I think there's some other things too. Our understanding of life and the sacredness of life. From womb to tomb, that God's Spirit is breathed into all people, all life, all aspects of life. And so then what is my responsibility? And as people look at life within the world, they're often struck with such death, such destruction, such violence, And this sense of hope, this sense of understanding the divinity of life, the sacredness of life, and how new life, emerges from some of that. What does that look like? Those are wonderful stories of our faith that I think across the board can be shared. Maybe our practices of how many times we go to church or how many might be defined differently, and maybe we need some conversations around that. But are we willing to have conversations kind of with open arms and affirmation and understanding versus this is it, and if you don't measure up, my question is, has these measurements always been the measurements we've used? Have these measurements always been the measurements we've used? Have these measurements always been the measurements we use? No. And you're going to get that as we move into church history in the next couple of courses.
Tony, it's good to be with you again here at this beautiful funeral home.
Thank you, Barbara. It's good to have you with us.
I don't know if people realize that you operate 2 funeral homes, not only this one on Cane Run Road, but one down on Market Street.
That's right. The whole staff that operates this funeral home also operates the one on Market Street, and we do go back and forth quite a bit. The one on Market Street is, I'm proud to say, the one that our grandfather began. It's the first Ratterman funeral home in the city that, as such.
A funeral home has to be 2 needs. They have to take care of 2 needs: the family of the deceased, and then also the visitors that come in.
Well, that's right. It can't be just pretty on its own merits. The whole purpose of the funeral home is to provide a place for families to receive the people that are important to them. And since the funeral home was built, we've even added a lot of things to the outside to soften it up, and we've done that. So when you come in here, the idea is that you're at a very special place.
Well, I know you've done some renovation to the lounges and some other places. Would you show those to me?
Well, I'd be glad to.
Okay.
Come on.
Thank you.
Okay.
Tony, I think one of the most important places in a funeral home is the lounge for the family. Tell us about this wonderful lounge.
Okay. Thank you. This lounge is designed to accommodate 3 families, 3 good-sized families at once. And a lot of times people bring food in, and so we have 2 refrigerators now. We used to have no refrigerators. Now we have 2 refrigerators. We decided last summer that we would make the inside of the funeral home non-smoking, and so we asked people to smoke outside. And that worked out good for the summertime, but when the winters start coming, it was a little uncomfortable for them, so we built these partitions of safety glass.
Tony, I think probably one of the greatest things that a family can do is to pre-arrange for a funeral.
A lot of times people are particular about, when I die, I want a certain thing to take place. And you have that opportunity when it's prearranged. And it just gives a real good roadmap to the family so they know what to follow and how to proceed. It doesn't have to be paid for ahead of time. It doesn't cost a thing. It only takes about 45 minutes or an hour.
Tony, thank you for allowing me to visit, and I have to say, truly, there is a beautiful spirit in this space.
Thank you. I like to think that there is too. There is for me.
In the early 1970s, Avery Della, most of us know him as a cardinal today, came out with a work called Models of Church. And in these models, he described 5 different models. And models sometimes are better because of, like we talked about in the first part of this, they're not absolute as much. They kind of give us an image or a picture that really encourages us to see it larger than just the words or the context, but there's something larger to it, but it kind of points a model, points us to a reality of what we know. And so it's the same thing here. And what I wanted to do in this part was not only describe these models that Avery Dulles gives us, but also perhaps help you define what your model is. Avery tells us that within the church, at least at the time of this writing, he felt there was 5 different particular models around the parish. And the questions were, what is the work of the parish, and what is the strength of the parish? And those are the questions that I gave you in your own exercise in terms of this. And for those that might be viewing the tape, the questions were such as, the most important work of the parish is to teach, sanctify, and give directions for the moral lives of the parishioners. The strength of the parish depends on strong leadership by the pastor. The most important work of the parish is to form a close feeling of community among the parishioners. The strength of the parish depends on the working of the Holy Spirit within and among the people. The most important work of the parish is to celebrate the Eucharist and administer the sacraments. And there were several of those that each of you were asked to look at and perhaps put into some kind of order or prioritize. Now the point is, all of these are important in our understanding of church and our theology of church, but we tend to put focus on one more than another. And that's what the exercise is, to see where is our sense of model? Where is it that we begin with? And it's vitally important as we come together in parishes, because as parish councils or parish committees or parishioners, what we feel is most important work, or what we feel is the strength, is where we're going to put our time, our energy, and most importantly, our money. I did an exercise years ago when I taught 8th grade religion at one of the local Catholic schools, and I gave everybody $1,000, all the kids $1,000, and I said, build a church that you want. That was another way to do this, because some of them took the $1,000 and said, we need to give this to the poor. And some of them took the $1,000 and says, we need to put big speakers in the church. And some of them took the $1,000 and said, we need to gather around coffee and donuts. There's one you've heard before. We need hospitality. We need to come in for fun. So people will come here. We got to be appealing to people. And these were all different models. Now, we know all of these are important, but when it comes to the buck, we tend to have a stronger desire than the other of where we should spend it. So we want to begin to look at what are these models that Avery giving us and where we find ourselves. So again, those of you who are viewing the tape, I'm going to be asking you to think about, when you think about the most important work of the church or parish and or the strength of the parish, what are the things that come to mind as you listen to these folks on what they feel? So the first question is, how many people had the most important of the work of the parish is to teach, sanctify, and give direction for the moral lives of the parishioners? Anybody have that as number 1 and number 2? Can you tell us a little bit about why you did that? Why did you put that over the others? Francine? That's how you grew up. That's how you understood the church. That the role of the church was basically to teach us what we need to know, sanctify salvation of souls, and give direction, tell us what we have to do, and so on and so forth. And for you, that's an important work of it, and you would not want to see that at the cost of the others.
And for the strength of the parish to depend on strong leadership by the pastor, it's really important to me because our pastor is our deacon. Yeah. We don't have a priest. Yeah. And his leadership is what's keeping us together. Very good.
So you see that the focal point of that single leader as the strength of the parish. And if the leader was to fall, so would the parish in a sense. That person is pivotal. Now, let me ask others this. When you think in terms of the most important work of the parish is to teach, rule, and sanctify, or the strength is in the pastor, did anybody have that? Francine put those as first. Did any of you put them as last? Okay. Can you talk a little bit about that, sister, you radical, you?
Because it's, the people that gather together that are going to enliven, engage each other, and make it happen. If it's coming from an authority figure, it's, I guess, old church to me, and it's, this is what you do, hellfire and brimstone kind of thing. And
very good. So for you, it's the community gathered, it's the people gathered that give support to one another, encourage and challenge one another, not from a single entity but from one another in relationship. So how you gather in community is really important. Now, Francine can see that as important, but you can see that was your last, and this was your first. And your starting point in this is really critical, okay? And let me say why, because when you look at this, most people, when they look at this list that they compile, they say, well, all these things are important. But if we have this, the rest will come. You with me? And that's why you can't mess up with the order, you see, because this has to happen first. And that's critical because when it comes to us in gathering, and you think of most of the arguments or most of the discussions I've experienced in parishes and on committees and even amongst parishioners, it tends to come from what their particular model is and where they particularly think they need to start. So the exercise is to help you to identify that. Now, I gave you a scoring sheet that you could collect those scores to be able to define what model you have. And then on that scoring sheet, there's actually 6 particular models. The 5 come from Avery Dulles' book, Models on Church. Later on, there was a book written by him called The Church We Believe In. And the church we believe in, he spoke about another model called Community of Disciples. And I want to take some time and describe each one of these models. And again, you took the survey, you took the instrument. Many of you that are watching the video did not. But as you listen to these models, no matter what you put on the sheet or if you didn't take the sheet, try to identify where you most find yourself, okay? There's weaknesses and strengths in all of these, and that's kind of what we're trying to bring out. But the church, going back to the first part of this, consists of all these models. And so we want to just begin to identify them, if you will. Now, the first one I want to talk about is the institutional model. Anybody here was the institutional model?
And that surprised me. I didn't think I would see that.
Okay, so we have 2 or 3 folks in the institutional model. Some are afraid to admit it. Some are proud of it. Some just want to talk. No, okay, you were institutional model. Okay, so, well, that's pretty good. So we have 1, 2, 3 people, 4 maybe, that are institutional model. Let's talk a little bit about the institutional model. Like I said, all these models have strengths and weaknesses. Now, keep in mind, and the video couldn't see this maybe, but there are men and women. There are young and old. Okay, so that's important. That model exists across cultures, denominations, not denominations in this group, but cultures, gender, and so on and so forth. So, and age. So, let's just talk a little bit about that institutional model and see if this might be where you find yourself. It was the predominant model, not only found in that decade, but predominantly the model before Vatican II. That was the predominant model. The scripture passage that would help support this would be found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. And it's defining church, not so much that scripture passage, but this model defines church as a very visible structure, highly organized with an established hierarchy and rights and powers bestowed upon that hierarchy so the people will follow and know direction and what to do and so on and so forth. The mission, clear. Teach. What are the sacred truths? How do we pass those on? How have we held them through time and history? Rule. This is the law, and there's a certain level of accountability. Sanctify. Salvation of souls. And even in a pre-Vatican notion, that whole notion of, we talked a little bit about this, Catholic only, in terms of who is saved, is that body of believers. Now, the members themselves are those that follow the doctrines, that believe in that profess the doctrines. So if you were defining in this day and age who's a Catholic, that's where it would be. It's basically who listened to the prescribed laws, follow the rules, live that out, and so on and so forth. They were obedient and trusting. Okay, the term of pray, pay, and obey. You know, that's all the laity were called to do, is some of the accusation. That's some of the weaknesses of it, because it created, to a certain extent, a passive laity. It creates a passive laity, not that engagement of any kind of leadership or any kind of ministry sharing or collaborative ministry, but you basically do what you're told.
Learned dependence.
And you're dependent on those that know. So there's power from those that know, there's control from those that know, and that could be seen as a negative in some ways. So a lot of it was fear-based. So, the strengths, though, and capitalize on the strengths here, there was a clear identity. Everybody knew what it meant to be Catholic. And the institutional model provides that for us. There's stability. Tell me what I need to know. That sense of certainty that I think is often very appealing. The followers know exactly what is expected of them. Okay, that's the challenge, criticism here. Nobody knows, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. Here we knew clearly what we're supposed to be doing. We might not necessarily know all the whys of it, but we knew what it was. It was easy to learn and easy to pass on. And that's a real strength of this way of this model. Okay, everybody knows, and I know what to tell my kids. You could learn based on memorization. Now, if you remember this period of time and this understanding that it could be heavy on the catechism with limits to Scripture, limitations on Scripture, or really an appreciation of Scripture, or appreciation of a lived tradition. One of the other weaknesses we talked about is the laity becomes passive, almost like sheep to be led. And as you studied, or you will study in our history of ministry, that was a perceived understanding, that the ministers were those that led the sheep, and the laity were those that were the sheep. It relies heavily on the law and the rubrics, and can lose a sense of the spirit of the law. It can focus, and somebody said this earlier, but it can focus so much on the structure and maintenance of the structure that it could lose sight of the mission in the world. And again, it's kind of an absolute approach to one's faith that we have all the answers. So we can seem very exclusive, not only within the context of our own tradition, but to other traditions. And these are some of the weaknesses of that. So, and I think, predominantly being a pre-Vatican kind of notion, then Vatican II came along, and Vatican II's understanding of what it means to be church and its model. The predominant model that came out of Vatican II was the church as community. And so if you have yours as either community or a people of God, those are all the languages. One of the models that Avery talks about is that of community. Okay? People of God be the same kind of interpretation to understand that. The church is clearly the community of people. When we started, Sister, I think the first thing we said, I said, what is your image of church? I don't even know if I wrote it down. But you said the community gathered. So when you told us a minute ago what your greatest strength is, okay. But when you told us what your greatest strength is in terms of the sense of community, that would be true of this model. That's how this model would feel. That it is the community gathered. It's not focused on one single leader or institution, but the community gathered together. The ministry and mission of the community gathered is to form a community of believers for support, witness, challenge of their faith. That's why the circle. This one. Within the membership have a part within that. So, and the members consist of the laity and priest, bishop, pope, in terms of, in relationship with one another. Each have different roles, but each role collaboratively make up the body. The priest's role is sacramental. People's role is to be as disciples, to live as Jesus did. Membership is generally defined by what we believe together and acceptance of one another. The strength is it could be very charismatic, relational, attractive to people. There's a sense of welcoming and hospitality that one might find in this community that doesn't find elsewhere. The challenge comes in is if those people do find that elsewhere, then what place does this have? Why then would I be part of that church? because that's what it does. Its strength is what it has to offer. But it offers a community that's alive in the spirit, generally very charismatic, welcoming, friendly, ongoing. You know, if you think about this particular time when this ecclesiology was pretty predominant and this model was and still continues to be, you know, you had the coffee and donuts, you had the churches in the round, you had the holding hands in the Our Father, you had that sense and that visible expression that we're in this together. The weaknesses is, like any circle, it could become exclusive. Just what happens in here. And to be part of this, you have to come in here to make it happen. And if you know this, I mean, if you've been part of, you know, I've been part of moving across the country in different places and experiencing different parishes, particularly that really capitalize on this, as wonderful as it can be, it's very hard for an outsider to get into. It's almost like an elite kind of a group. And there's a sense of assumption that we all think alike, we all believe alike, and we all love each other. Kind of like a love-in, I guess. I don't know, bad example. But I mean, in terms of, trying to give you an idea of this, you know, a sense of, there's a shared sense. And that isn't always the case. And partly, if I don't think like that, how do I get in? You know, how do I get involved in this community? The focus can be what I get out of it. Am I fed? Am I nurtured? And lose a sense of what I'm called to do outside that circle. So as long as I'm here, everything makes sense, and everything out there really doesn't, because those people just don't understand this reality. And so therefore, the other weaknesses have become very self-focused. Focuses on us as a parish, as a community, and never darkening the door of a parish that might be 3 blocks away, let alone a community, congregation, faith community other than our own, you know, or let alone even Catholics that think differently than us. You know, and we're experiencing this in this archdiocese and many dioceses in terms of regionalization. It's a challenge right now because we have parishes with very different models coming together and trying to do things together. And it's a very visible sign of the tension. And yet, I do see, from my vantage point, working for the Archdiocese, I can see, as difficult as it is, wonderful things emerging that wouldn't have emerged. But often when you bring these groups together and they challenge one another, the strength of our tradition really does surface. It's not in, again, it's the both end. But it's hard getting there. I mean, again, this is easy to talk about and very difficult to do, so I want to name that. Okay, next one is the sacramental model of church as sacrament. If that was high on your list, this is how it was defined by Avery. The church is a sign and instrument of God's presence. So the church, the way that understanding of theology of church comes about is it's a sign, a sacrament, if you will, of God's presence in the world. So it's pointing to something. It's not in and of itself, but it's always pointing to something more, that sense of mystery. You know, we talked about that sense of never really fully understanding. It's always emerging, always evolving, calling you to more. The mission and ministry of that particular parish or that community would be then to celebrate the sacraments. That's critical to it. Source and summit kind of language and emphasis. And then the people being a sign, a sacramental sign for Christ's presence in the world. Heavy emphasis on ritual, rite, rubrics. The role of the laity is pretty much to receive and celebrate those sacraments and signs, and the clerics are pretty much to administer and actuate those signs. Now, the strengths of the sacramental model is this sense of pointing to mystery. And I have already named that many of the folks that go to other congregations and other traditions and other faith traditions to find inspiration in good preaching and so on and so forth, find themselves coming back because they miss that sense of ritual, that sense of rite, that sense of somehow we are a church of bells and whistles, though. You know, I mean, I want to talk about my past. I don't know how to do that in an appropriate way. But he's got the greatest Batman outfits. I mean, he's just got, I mean, that's what I think of it in terms of Batman. You know, he's got the greatest outfits. I mean, these things, he does the triduum and stuff. And you got to see, you know, and I love it to an extent because it doesn't talk about, it's not to talk about him. It's to talk about what we're celebrating. You know, and I would only imagine that people aren't raised in the tradition when they see the way we use candles and light and darkness and vestments and all that stuff. It's like experiencing Batman. It's kind of like experiencing, oh my God, you know, there's something large here, you know, and that is really what this particular model, I think, emphasizes. There's a sense of humility that we experience with that. I think that is really of value. The weaknesses is we can become sacramental factories. Like we have something and you don't. And so then if you do this for 6 months and you do for this 3 months, there's a sense, that's not what we mean. Again, but the weaknesses is it can be interpreted as, okay, so if I do this and this, I get a sacrament. And so that place is to give me a sacrament. And you even hear this language sometimes, you know. And so that's one of the weaknesses. It can be interpreted as that. It can seem to become too automatic and magical, and lose really the power of ritual and what that really means. It's very difficult, as most mystery, to explain. And if you know this, because you know people wonder from other traditions and other churches, what do they do over there? You know, in a sense, you know, it's very difficult to explain. And even for our own community, it's very hard to articulate what is the meaning of a sacrament. What is the meaning of mystery? You know, we get in, those of you in discipleship or in any formation within the Ministry Institute. That's the thing you're always challenged by, you know, is we just bring larger questions than we ever do answers. So it's hard to articulate tangible, see, tell me what it is, give it to me. You know, that sense of certainty that we want is very difficult with a sacramental model. Okay, so as long as you're comfortable with that, this might be a model that speaks to you, but others have difficulties that can't capture it, if you will. Next one is herald. Let me go back a little because I missed this, but in the sacrament model, the gospel passage you might want to look at that represents that is in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, 1 through 10. And for community, it's 1 Corinthians. So the model of community I described, it would be 1 Corinthians 12, the one I read in the first part of this. The body of Christ. Okay. Herald, Luke 10, 1 through 16. The definition is to proclaim the good news. Okay? Proclaim the good news. Read it, learn it, go out and speak it. I think this particular model comes a lot from maybe our Baptist roots, our Baptist tradition, at least in this archdiocese and culture that kind of have fed us. But also across the country, it comes out more in kind of a fundamentalist or non-denominational approach where Scripture alone is kind of the source of the teaching. But even within Catholics, we believe, there's many of us that really emphasize, in many ways, this particular model as being first. The Bible is primary. The job is to spread the good news and evangelize. Members preach in the world. Clerics inspire us on Sunday. The strength is it's scriptural, it's clear, it's in writing. It can be inspiring, as many of you know. There's this charismatic preachers that can just really pull people in, and really there's a sense of change that happens, transformation that happens in hearing the word. But the weakness is a lot of times it can be very short-lived. So it's very dependent on the preacher, dependent on the messenger, but the message hasn't necessarily really taken root. Again, not always, but again, this is some of the weaknesses. So it might not have a long-term longevity to it. Might not be as lasting as one would like. The other thing is, I think I've said this enough, but in terms of as you raise up one, there's generally a cost to the other. And often when you push the preaching and the word, you lose the sense of sacraments. I had a pastor one time that he rarely would preach, or he preached very in short pieces on those days of rites and rituals that he celebrated or the community celebrated, whether it be the rite of election or the rite of acceptance or whatever it was, baptisms, whatever we did as a church. And partly because in his belief, right or wrong, was the ritual spoke of itself. Again, that's that sense of mystery. Now, a lot of people, they don't get it that quick, that, oh, it just speaks for itself. They want to hear the preaching. They want to hear the word. Tell me what it means in a sense. And that's kind of the separation between these two to help you make a distinction.
Into that area?
Uh,
Softer.
The process of RCIA falls into...
Harold?
It depends. I mean, I think... Oh, the one I used... Right, I was trying to say that if you celebrate some of these rites liturgically, this particular person felt that the rite, the ritual, the sacraments that we celebrated, the rituals that we celebrated, not so much the sacraments of that, but the rituals that we celebrated should speak for themselves. And there shouldn't be a whole lot of explanation to. That's a sacrament model, where the herald model would say, no, tell me how this ties to the word. Tell me how you preach this. Inspire me. Put words on it in a sense. And so what I'm saying is one sometimes can be in tension with the other. Not always, but in terms of at least the weaknesses that he brought about in the book was that a person with a strong herald model, sometimes the sacraments can be played down. My example might not have been the best one, but sacraments could be played down. Servant, Matthew 25:31-46. Most of you know this. When you see me and I was hungry, did you give me food? When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? Servant is to serve all the needs of the people. The mission and ministry is service, and basically most of the work is not in the community but outside the community. There's churches that exist across the country that their focus is on the outside of the community. They may or may not have actual parish membership or even keep track to that. That's not how they gather as church. They gather that if there's one inner city parish, I'm thinking in particular, that if there's a murder or a stabbing or some act of violence, they and maybe a small group of people in that community go and pray with the community at large and try to ritualize this in some way. To do that, that's their mission. It's not about coming here on Sunday. It's a different mission. It's a very servant model. They advocate for the poor and oppressed. The strengths are, it's really based on the life and action of Jesus. Jesus was out there with the prisoner, and he was out there with the tax collectors, and he was out there with the prostitutes, and so on and so forth. And he was ministering in a sense of being with them, caring for them in a way. And so they have a real measurement, something tangible, a person that they can see and try to copy and live as Jesus did.
Barbara, welcome to Joe Ratterman & Son Funeral Home.
Joe, thank you. It's good to be here again. In January, it will be 140 years since the Rattermans have been caring for families in the funeral business. How do you explain that longevity?
Oh gosh, that goes all the way back to before the Civil War ended. My great-grandfather started it and passed it on to his children, and then my dad's generation, and now my generation, and we were all basically born above the funeral home, so we think we know what we're doing.
Joe, the Rattermans have a wonderful reputation of caring. Is that why families come back time after time?
Yes, generation after generation come back when they need us, and we, of course, do the best we can each time.
Joining us is Bob Markert, and Bob recently lost his father, and you came to Joe Ratterman & Son Funeral Home. Why did you come here?
We came to Ratterman's because it is the place that we've been able to entrust our grief and our loved ones for, as Joe has said, many generations. My grandfather, my own baby, was buried by Joe's father. The care with which they treat all of the families that are here. One of the nice things about the Rattermans are they're there when you need them and not there when you don't. So you feel comfortable with their care.
Joe, I know one of the more difficult things for a grieving family is to come to the selection room. How have you changed that process?
Well, we've made it a little easier because we've gone from full-size open caskets to fractional small pieces of caskets. We've discovered that families are intimidated and are not comfortable with a full-size open casket, especially in the time of need. So we've gone to the smaller ones, and we've noticed that families feel so much better, and they're able to spend more time making a good decision.
And also you've installed an elevator.
Yes, we have. Yes, we're now everyone can participate in the decision. We don't have to leave the handicapped folks downstairs.
Joe, thank you for being with us. And also I'd like to thank you and all the Vattermans for the care that you've given Louisville families for nearly 140 years.
The strength is it's not in for itself. It's much more mission-oriented. And it can live a life of compassion, love, mercy, caring, so on and so forth, things that we are called to do. The weaknesses is, and I've heard this actually, I've actually heard this with this model because it's interesting. In the servant model, if you look at your own numbers where you came up, my guess is many of you came very low in this. You know, and the key here is to try to find an equal balance between these. So if you have one that you weighted as the most important and it came up number 12, and servant came up number 2, so if institution is 12 and servant is 2, you have to look at that. Okay? You have to really look at that, and that's what the exercise is for. All of these are important, obviously. I was working with a parish council one time, and a pastor said this to me. I asked that very question, why are we often low on servants? And this is what he said to me, which speaks to this weakness. We have social agencies and others where people can be involved to do that. That's not the place of the church. And my first reaction was it sounded like something out of Scrooge. You know, the Christmas story, Christmas Carol. But it better thought, I started thinking, and I understood what he was saying in terms of we come together. Keep in mind, his model was sacrament. We come together to share the sacraments. And yes, those things are important, but this is primary. They can do those other places. No place else can they come and share the sacraments. See the thinking? But again, a 12 and a 2, you know, and this is often the committees we can't get people on. We look at budgets. We hire people to teach, rule, and sanctify. We don't pay people necessarily in the sense of social justice, social action. Some parishes do. I don't want to say we don't. But where it is in our budgets, you'll often find where our model is. The weaknesses can be very action-oriented, be low sacramental, much like the herald. And there might not be a whole lot of reflection to our action or contemplation. You know, and that's another one of those both ends of the Catholic Church. We're called to action, works, but we're also called to prayer, relationship with God, discernment. And how does that fill in? And and again, the sacrament piece. The last one I want to talk about in the few minutes we have left is really community of disciples. And more you're seeing this model become larger and larger in groups like this. And the community of disciples is pretty interesting because I think, again, Avery kind of came up with this afterwards, but it really defines the church, the model of church, that the church is a learner, a pilgrim church. You heard this a lot. A church that is constantly trying to engage and learn in realities that could never be fully expressed. And somehow in the dynamics of this reality is where we find church. You know, there's a beautiful thing out, I think it came from the Episcopal Church, I don't think I have it, but the signs of a healthy church, if you've ever read that. You know, it's where you can't find any parking spaces, where everything's broken because it's used so much, and you can't find a classroom because there's so many activities, you know what I'm saying? I mean, there's that sense that there's such involvement, and that's what we have, I think, in a huge part in many of our congregations, that there's so many activities, so many is going on, so many trying to discern how God is calling us, you know, not only within our own congregation, but even beyond that, and how do we call others to do that, and never really fully capturing it. Now, I think the strength of that is it does speak to mystery, and it does speak to the both end. And it does speak to church as a much more dynamic reality. And I think at the heart of Paul in the body of Christ, probably, my guess is, there would have been identifying with Paul with this particular model. Okay? However, as all the models, it has its weaknesses. One is it can be unclear. Okay, very unclear. And often it's heard, as we've even heard today, well, that means everything's okay. Okay, so everything's okay. Where really at the heart of this is not saying everything's okay, it's just we can never really capture the fullest truth. And so how do we constantly engage in that as a community, as a believer? And it doesn't mean we don't have the truth, but we never have it in its fullest. It's always calling us to pilgrim. But it can be seen as unclear and not having anything. Then I don't have to do anything. It can be seen as a little bit no structure. So then where is the structure? What is the place of the people in it? One of the greatest challenges, I say that pretty large, but one of the challenges within the church today is identity. Not only who we are as Catholics, but who am I as priest? Who am I as layperson? Who am I as religious? And what's the distinction between? And this particular model doesn't allow for a lot of distinctions often. It's very non-structured. And it could be very challenging for us because it calls us never to really be that certain. And particularly in this culture, and our American culture, and our American understanding, that sense of certainty creates power, control, understanding. We know how we navigate within it. And when we don't have it, from our understanding, we're challenged by it. Must be signed that it's over. I really encourage you to continue. I mean, the learning is going to ongoing when we move into the next pieces of church history and church development. But I want you to really sit with these models because my guess is this is how you do church. This is what you bring to your church. This might not be what your community is doing, but this is what you're calling your community to do. And realize that somehow in Paul's invitation to us as we started this is it is a dynamic reality. We are called to live in the tension, as difficult as it is. And when we hear those people that aggravate us the most, sometimes they could have the greatest message for us. And at the same time, we have to be assured of where we are, that we can also not only advocate, but to really bring the essence, in your case, of that institutional model. And what does it mean? And what is the value of the structure? And how can we do that in a way that it could be fully embraced by the body, not seeing the head without the heart, but really as a total body?
You have been watching one of the many offerings available through the Archdiocese of Louisville Ministry Institute. If you would like to register for a class or find out more about both taped and live offerings, you may contact Sal Della at 448-8581, or if you prefer, you may email at almi@archlou.org.
This Archdiocese Today is available on home video. To place your order, call 636-0296, extension 1230. Cost for either DVD or VHS is $14.95 plus $2 shipping and handling. Or you may email video@archlou.org.